The Galactic Council had exactly 3 laws that everyone agreed upon. The first was, don't blow up inhabited planets. The second was, don't eat sentient beings. And the third, the one that would later be known as the biggest mistake in legislative history, was absolutely positively, under no circumstances, employ mercenaries. This seemed perfectly reasonable at the time. The Council, in its infinite wisdom, had determined that mercenaries were the cause of roughly 93% of all galactic conflicts. The other 7% was accounting errors, so they banned them, completely, utterly, with a penalty so severe that merely thinking about hiring a mercenary could get you a 50,000 credit fine and mandatory attendance at a seminar called Violence is Not the Answer, a 12-week workshop. The Vrelian ambassador, a being named Korvath, whose species looked like someone had given a praying mantis a law degree and too much coffee, had championed this legislation with the kind of enthusiasm usually reserved for people who've never actually needed military protection. Violence, he declared while his 6 arms gestured dramatically, is merely the failure of adequate diplomatic discourse. This worked brilliantly for about 3 months. Then the Zithian sovereignty decided they wanted the Peloric cluster, which technically belonged to the Peloric Commonwealth, who were understandably reluctant to hand over 38 star systems because someone asked nicely. The Commonwealth went to the Council for help. The Council formed a committee. The committee formed a subcommittee. The subcommittee scheduled a meeting to discuss forming a task force. By the time the task force had agreed on the font for their letterhead, the Zithians had conquered 18 of the 38 systems. "But we can't hire mercenaries," wailed the Peloric representative, a blob-like creature named Gelfos, who communicated through color changes, and was currently flashing a shade of purple that roughly translated to, "We're all going to die." "Have you tried," suggested Korvath helpfully, "talking to them?" Gelfos turned a color that had no direct translation, but roughly meant, "I will personally excrete acid on your furniture." This scenario repeated itself across the galaxy with depressing regularity. Conflicts erupted. The Council formed committees. Committees formed subcommittees. Subcommittees argued about comma placement in strongly worded letters. People died waiting for the paperwork to clear. The Council refused to admit their mercenary ban might have been slightly short-sighted. Instead, they doubled down, creating the Galactic Peacekeeping Initiative, which was supposed to be a military force that technically wasn't mercenary work because it was government-sponsored. The GPI had 3 ships, 500 personnel, and was responsible for protecting 47,000 inhabited systems. Their response time averaged 6 months. During one particularly heated council session, a junior diplomat from the Thelonian Collective, desperate and possibly drunk on fermented spore wine, suggested maybe they could bend the rules just a little. The council's response was swift and unanimous. No. They did, however, increase the GPI's budget by 2%, which allowed them to buy a 4th ship. It immediately broke down. Into this magnificent disaster stumbled humanity. Humans had been spacefaring for roughly 30 years when they encountered the Galactic Council, which in cosmic terms was approximately 5 minutes ago. They'd been granted provisional membership status, which meant they could attend council meetings, but couldn't vote, propose legislation, or use the good bathroom on the 3rd floor. They could, however, observe, and observe they did. A human named Jillian Kowalski sat in the gallery during one of these council sessions, watching with increasing fascination as the representatives argued about whether military intervention and peacekeeping action were legally distinct concepts. Jillian had served 15 years in the Canadian Armed Forces before transitioning to private security work, and she recognized bureaucratic cowardice when she saw it. The current debate concerned the Vothic crisis, where the Vothic supremacy was systematically dismantling the Corellian defense stations, and the Corellians, lacking any military force of their own, were reduced to filing formal complaints. 732 formal complaints, to be exact. The Vothics had sent a response. Noted, thanks for the feedback. We cannot, I repeat, cannot hire soldiers of fortune, Corvath was shouting, all 6 arms trembling with righteous indignation. The law is absolute. Then change the damn law, someone yelled from the back. This caused a 30-minute recess while the council recovered from such a radical suggestion. Gillian left the chamber and found her way to one of the station's many overpriced cafeterias, where she met 2 other humans, Diego Fernandez, formerly of the U.S. Marines and now working as a security consultant for various Earth corporations, and Yuki Tanaka, who'd done time with the Japanese self-defense forces before realizing civilian pay was significantly better. This is insane, Gillian said, stirring something that claimed to be coffee, but tasted like regret. They've got wars breaking out everywhere, but hiring anyone to actually fight is illegal. The peacekeeping initiative, Diego started, has 4 ships for 47,000 systems, Gillian interrupted. I did the math. That's statistically less useful than thoughts and prayers. Yuki was quiet, which was typical for her. She was reading through the council's legal codes on her datapad, her expression one of intense concentration. Finally, she looked up with the kind of smile that usually preceded either genius or felony. They banned mercenaries, she said slowly. Yes, said Gillian, we established this. No, listen. They banned mercenaries, soldiers for hire, people who fight for money. That's what I said. But what if, Yuki continued, her smile widening, we're not mercenaries? What if we're something else entirely? Diego leaned forward. What are you thinking? I'm thinking, said Yuki, about semantics and lawyers and the fact that humans are really good at finding loopholes in rules we don't like. She turned her datapad around. On it was the council's legal definition of mercenary. Any individual or group who engages in armed conflict in exchange for monetary compensation outside the structure of a recognized governmental or military organization. Outside the structure, Yuki repeated, tapping the screen. What if we create a structure? The council won't recognize a mercenary corporation, Gillian pointed out. No, but they might recognize a consulting firm, a private contractor, a corporation that provides, say, security solutions, risk management services, conflict resolution specialists. Diego started laughing. You're talking about corporate speak, turning war into a business model. I'm talking about giving them exactly what they need while staying technically within their stupid law. Yuki's eyes were bright now. We're not mercenaries. We're professional consultants who happen to specialize in kinetic negotiations. Kinetic negotiations, Gillian repeated. That's genuinely terrible. That's genuinely perfect, Diego corrected. No one in that council chamber would know what it means, but it sounds legitimate enough that they won't question it. We'd need lawyers, Gillian said. Mountains of lawyers. Humanity has lawyers the way other species have bacteria, Yuki said. Abundant, persistent, and occasionally useful. They sat there for a moment, contemplating what they were about to unleash upon an unsuspecting galaxy. The Council had spent decades trying to eliminate military violence through legislation. Humans were about to demonstrate that violence, much like water, simply finds new channels when you try to dam it up. So, Diego said finally, who wants to start a consulting firm? 3 months later, Kowalski Fernandez Tanaka Solutions LLC opened its doors. Well, technically it opened its website, since doors were expensive, and they were operating out of Diego's apartment on Earth. Their business model was simple. They provided comprehensive security consultation services to clients experiencing interpersonal conflict escalation scenarios. Their first client was the Corellian representative, who contacted them in desperation after the Vothic supremacy destroyed Defense Station 93. 300 Corellians died. The council sent a strongly worded letter and scheduled a vote on whether to form an exploratory committee to investigate the feasibility of considering economic sanctions. The Corellian representative, whose name was Telmaris and who had the appearance of an exceptionally anxious jellyfish, met with the three humans in a rented conference room on the council station. "You can help us." Telmaris's voice came through a translator that made everything sound vaguely like whale song. "Legally?" "Absolutely," Gillian said, sliding a contract across the table. It was 38 pages long, mostly because their legal team, two recently graduated law students who worked for Pizza and Experience, had padded it extensively. KFT Solutions specializes in defensive infrastructure protection and hostile actor deterrence. I don't understand what that means." "It means," Diego said gently, "we'll stop the Vothics from blowing up your stuff." "But the council banned mercenaries." "We're not mercenaries," Yuki said, her voice perfectly calm. "We're independent contractors operating under a licensed corporate structure, completely different." "How is it different?" "We have a mission statement," Gillian said, "and quarterly reviews." "Mercenaries don't have quarterly reviews." Telmaris's coloration shifted through several shades that the translator interpreted as confusion, hope, and "what the hell, we're desperate." He signed the contract. "Excellent," said Gillian. "Now about our compensation structure. We require immediate payment," Diego interrupted, "of 400,000 credits. Telmaris's color went to something the translator labeled mild cardiac event. "That's triple what a mercenary would charge." "Yes, but we're providing additional services," Yuki explained. "Comprehensive after-action reports, strategic consultation, PowerPoint presentations." "PowerPoint?" "With animations," Gillian added. "Mercenaries never provide animated slides." The Corellians paid. KFT Solutions assembled their team, 32 former military personnel from various Earth nations, all of whom needed steady employment and were comfortable with the ethical ambiguity of their new careers. They arrived in the Corellian system on a converted cargo hauler they'd renamed the Comprehensive Solutions Platform. The Vothics, monitoring their approach, sent a standard warning. "Unidentified vessel. You are entering a restricted conflict zone. Withdraw immediately or face military action." Gillian, sitting in the captain's chair they'd salvaged from a restaurant that was going out of business, opened communications. "This is Gillian Kowalski, Senior Conflict Resolution Specialist with KFT Solutions. We're here to provide defensive infrastructure protection services to our client." There was a long pause. "You're mercenaries?" "No!" Gillian sounded genuinely offended. "We're licensed contractors, completely different. We have business cards." Another pause. The Council banned mercenaries. We're consultants. It's in our corporate charter. Would you like to see our charter? It's very thorough, 53 pages. The Vothic commander, a being named Krathix, who'd spent the last 8 months effortlessly conquering Corellian territory, was confused. Confusion was not an emotion Krathix was accustomed to feeling. "What's the difference between a mercenary and a contractor?" "Approximately 200,000 credits, Diego said cheerfully from his station, "and we offer dental." "This is a military conflict zone." "This is a client security enhancement zone," Yuki corrected. "Please update your terminology to reflect current professional standards." Krathix decided this was pointless. The humans had 1 ship, he had 30. "I'm going to destroy you now." "That would constitute a breach of our client's service agreement," Gillian said. "We'd have to file a formal complaint." "I don't care about your complaint." "You should. Our legal team is very persistent. They'll tie you up in litigation for years. Do you know how expensive good lawyers are? Of course not. You've been using military force instead of proper legal channels. Very inefficient." Krathix closed the channel and ordered his ships to fire. What happened next would be studied in military academies for decades, though the official reports would carefully avoid the word mercenary and instead used terms like contracted defensive action and third-party security implementation. The humans were, quite simply, good at violence, not because they enjoyed it, well, some of them enjoyed it, but that was beside the point, but because they'd spent thousands of years perfecting the art of killing each other efficiently. They'd had practice, lots of practice, an embarrassing amount of practice, really. The Vothics had conquered the Corellians easily because Corellians, like most species in the Council, had outsourced their aggressive impulses to diplomatic committees. The Corellians wrote beautiful poetry about peace. They composed symphonies celebrating harmony. They were terrible at war. Humans wrote poetry too, but theirs was usually about how war was hell and then going to war anyway. The Comprehensive Solutions Platform, which was 70% cargo hold, 20% life support, and 10% weapons that Diego had described as completely legal for civilian vessels, I checked, tore through the Vothic formation like a chainsaw through diplomatic courtesy. The humans employed tactics the Vothics had never encountered: false retreats, coordinated crossfire patterns, targeting systems that actually hit what they aimed at. Within 6 hours, 12 Vothic ships were disabled, 3 were destroyed. The rest withdrew to a safe distance, where Krathic sent an emergency communication to the Vothic High Command. "We have a problem," he said. "The Corellians hired humans." "Mercenaries, that's illegal. They claim they're consultants." "Well, what's the difference?" "I don't know, but they're really good at it." The High Command consulted their own legal advisors, who consulted the Galactic Council's regulations, who admitted that while the spirit of the law clearly prohibited this, the letter of the law had a loophole you could fly a battleship through. The Council formed an emergency committee to investigate. Meanwhile, KFT Solutions completed their contract. The Vothics, unwilling to face the humans again, and discovering that actual military opposition was far more annoying than Council complaints, withdrew from Corellian space. Telmaris, overjoyed, recommended KFT Solutions to 3 other species currently experiencing interpersonal conflict escalation scenarios. Within 6 months, Kowalski-Fernandez-Tanaka Solutions had 40 contracts, 200 personnel, and a fleet of 8 converted cargo haulers. They'd also spawned 33 competitor firms with names like Strategic Defense Associates, Guardian Force Consultants, and Smith & Wesson Interstellar Solutions, which was just the old weapons manufacturer seeing a business opportunity. The galaxy was discovering that humans had a particular genius for violence dressed up in corporate terminology. The Galactic Council, to put it mildly, was not happy about this development. Quorvath called an emergency session, his 6 arms trembling with rage. "This is a mockery of our laws." "With respect," said the human ambassador, a diplomatic official named Patricia Okonkwo, who'd been briefed extensively by KFT Solutions' legal team. "My understanding is that these are legitimate businesses operating within council regulations. They're mercenaries. They're contractors. The distinction is clearly defined in subsection 389 of the Commercial Enterprise Act. That act is about trade goods. It's about commercial entities providing services across council space," Patricia corrected calmly. "Military consultation is a service. They're registered businesses. They pay taxes. They maintain proper licensing. What law specifically are they violating?" Quorvath's translator made a sound like a tea kettle screaming. "The spirit of the law." "Ah," said Patricia. "The spirit. Could you point me to where spirit is defined in Council legal code? I've been searching for that section." This kicked off a legal battle that would consume the next 8 months. The Council, determined to shut down this human loophole, drafted new legislation explicitly banning private military contractors, security consultants, defensive solution providers, and any entity that provides armed services for compensation regardless of corporate structure or terminology employed. The humans read this new legislation with interest. "They've closed the contractor loophole," Gillian observed. "Yep," said Diego. "So we need a new approach." said Yuki. Yep, said Diego again. They sat in silence for approximately 90 seconds. What if, Yuki said slowly, we're not providing armed services? We're literally providing armed services, Gillian pointed out. That's our entire business model. No, we're providing consultation. The fact that we're armed while consulting is incidental. That's the same loophole with different words. No, listen, we restructure. KFT Solutions doesn't fight anyone. We're purely advisory. We provide tactical consultation, strategic planning, logistics coordination. We have clients who implement our recommendations. Who are these clients? Diego asked. Subsidiaries, Yuki said. Technically separate corporations. They're not contractors because they're not independent. They're wholly owned subsidiaries providing implementation services based on our consultation. Gillian started laughing. You're creating a shell game. I'm creating a consulting ecosystem, Yuki corrected. It's completely different. One is shady mercenary work hiding behind paperwork. The other is legitimate business structuring that happens to achieve similar outcomes. What's the difference? Diego asked. The first one doesn't have org charts, Yuki said. We'll have excellent org charts. They restructured. KFT Solutions became a pure consultation firm. KFT Implementation Services, a separate corporation with different letterhead, handled actual military operations. When the council caught on and banned that too, they created KFT Advisory Group, KFT Tactical Solutions, and KFT Strategic Partners. When those were banned, they franchised. Suddenly there were hundreds of security consultation firms across the galaxy, all of them owned by different entities, all of them technically unconnected, all of them staffed primarily by humans who discovered that galactic conflict paid significantly better than anything available on Earth. The names got increasingly creative. Diplomatic Enforcement Associates, Peaceful Resolution Specialists, Harmony Through Strength Consulting. One firm, run by a former Navy SEAL with a sense of humor, called itself Definitely Not Mercenaries, LLC. The council banned each iteration. The humans adapted. It became a game, with the council's legal team trying to write loophole-proof legislation, while humanity's lawyers found new creative interpretations. At one point, humans started calling themselves independent military ethnographers, who were merely observing conflicts and occasionally participating for research purposes. The council banned that too. "This is insane!" Quorvath shouted during one session. "Every time we close a loophole, they open 3 more. "Perhaps," suggested a representative from the Deltari Confederation, a species that looked like someone had crossed a spider with a calculator, "we should simply re-legalize mercenaries. At least then we'd know what we're dealing with." The council chamber erupted in outrage. Quorvath went through 6 different shades of apoplectic. The suggestion was voted down 800 to 12. 3 days later, the Deltari Confederation quietly hired Definitely Not Mercenaries LLC to handle a border dispute with the Quelvan Authority. The humans showed up, provided what they called aggressive negotiation support, and resolved the conflict in 4 days. The council investigation took 9 months and concluded that while the Deltari had technically violated the spirit of multiple regulations, they hadn't technically violated the letter of any specific law. The dam broke. Within a year, 63 council species had hired human consultants for various security concerns. The humans were efficient, effective, and expensive. They were also, to everyone's surprise, relatively ethical. Oh, they'd fight for whoever paid them. But they had standards. No genocide, no biological weapons, no targeting civilians, no eating clients, which apparently needed to be specified after an incident with a species that considered employment contracts to include consumption rights. "We're not monsters," Gillian had explained during the tribunal investigating that incident. "We're professionals. There's a difference." "What difference?" demanded the prosecutor. "Professionals have standards. And PowerPoint presentations. Monsters have neither. The prosecutor, having no response to this, moved on to other questions. But the contract work, as lucrative as it was, came with complications, real complications. The kind that woke you up at 3 a.m. wondering if you'd made the right choices. KFT Solutions had taken a contract with the Yelvari people, a civilization that occupied a single planet and lacked faster-than-light travel. They were being invaded by the Rothian Empire, which wanted their planet's mineral resources and didn't particularly care about the 3 billion Yelvari living there. Simple job, Diego had said during the briefing. Defend the Yelvari long enough for the Council to negotiate a settlement. The Council won't negotiate anything useful, Gillian pointed out. Not our problem. We fulfill the contract terms. That's it. They deployed. 50 personnel, 3 ships. The Rothians had 200 ships and a military force that had conquered a dozen systems. But the Rothians were used to easy victories against species with no military experience. They weren't ready for humans who treated war like a profession. The battle lasted 3 weeks. The humans employed every trick they'd learned from Earth's long history of creative violence. Ambushes, false intelligence, psychological warfare. At one point, they hacked into the Rothian command network and broadcast vintage Earth heavy metal music at maximum volume for 36 hours straight. "What is this horrible sound?" the Rothian commander had screamed. "That's Slayer," replied the human communications officer. "Classic stuff. There's like 6 more albums. Want to hear them?" The Rothians did not want to hear them. The humans won, technically. They drove off the Rothian invasion force. The Yelvari were saved. The contract was fulfilled, but 33 humans died in that fight. 33 people who'd signed up to shoot at other people for money and found out too late that other people shot back. Gillian attended every funeral. So did Diego and Yuki. They stood there in their dress uniforms because they'd created dress uniforms, because apparently that made them more legitimate, and watched as people who'd trusted their leadership were loaded into coffins. "We did the right thing," Diego said quietly at one funeral. "Did we?" Gillian asked. "We fought someone else's war for money. That's the definition of mercenary work, no matter what we call it. The Yelvari would be dead if we hadn't. The Yelvari are alive because we were willing to kill for profit. What does that make us?" Diego had no answer. Neither did Yuki, who stood silently beside them, her expression unreadable. They returned to Earth, took a week off, and were immediately contacted by 8 new clients with 8 new conflicts. The galaxy, it turned out, had an inexhaustible supply of people willing to kill each other, and an equally inexhaustible supply of people willing to pay others to do violence on their behalf. The question of whether this was right kept Gillian awake most nights. The question of whether it was legal kept their lawyers busy. The question of whether it was profitable kept them in business. The Galactic Council, meanwhile, had reached peak frustration. They'd tried banning mercenaries. They'd tried banning contractors. They'd tried banning consultation services, advisory groups, strategic partners, and at one point simply any human carrying a weapon for purposes other than personal defense. Humans responded by carrying weapons for sporting purposes and cultural expression, and occasionally emotional support. "We can't ban humans," one council member pointed out during a particularly heated session. "Why not?" Corvath demanded. "Because we already voted them into provisional membership. Banning an entire species would violate approximately 15 different discrimination laws that we wrote. Then we ban weapons. We tried that. The humans started using improvised weapons. Do you know what they did on the Corvallis station conflict? They used lunch trays. They turned cafeteria equipment into effective combat tools. That's not even possible." The Corvallis medical team treated 63 beings with injuries caused by ergonomically designed plastic serving implements. The humans called it adaptive resource utilization. They have a training manual. The council sat in stunned silence. "Perhaps," suggested the Deltari representative quietly, "we're approaching this wrong. We can't eliminate violence. We've tried. For 300 years we've tried. Maybe we should regulate it instead." "Regulate? Mercenaries!" Quorvath's translator actually sparked. "That's the opposite of our entire legal framework. Our legal framework," the Deltari continued, "has been systematically dismantled by humans with business degrees. Maybe it's time to admit defeat and try something new." This suggestion was met with the kind of hostile silence usually reserved for proposals like eat glass or hold council sessions at reasonable hours. But the seed was planted. 6 months later, the council held a vote on the Private Military Operations Regulatory Framework, which was a very long way of saying, "We give up. Please just follow some rules." The regulations were extensive: mandatory registration, conduct standards, prohibited weapons, civilian protection protocols, and a requirement that all private military organizations submit monthly reports written in triplicate and notarized by a licensed council official. The humans read through the regulations with interest. "They're trying to control us through paperwork," Diego observed. "They're trying to control us through bureaucracy," Gillian corrected. "Which is adorable, really. Do they not know where humans come from? We invented bureaucracy. We have government agencies whose sole purpose is regulating other government agencies." "We can work with this," Yuki said, already drafting compliance protocols. "Actually, this is better for business. Now we're legitimized, official." "We're officially mercenaries," Gillian said. "No," Yuki corrected. "We're officially registered private military operators. Says so right here in subsection 12. Completely different." The regulations passed. Humans registered their companies. They filed their paperwork. They submitted their reports in triplicate. They attended mandatory safety seminars about proper warfare conduct. And business boomed. Because now it wasn't just humans. Other species saw that the council had effectively given up and decided they wanted in on this apparently lucrative market. Suddenly there were Vrelian security consultants and Deltari conflict resolution specialists, and even some Corellians who called themselves aggressive pacifists, which was philosophically confusing but operationally effective. The galaxy learned what humans had known for millennia. Violence is the universe's oldest profession, and calling it something else doesn't change what it is. Quorvath, watching his life's work crumble into semantic debris, retired from the council and moved to a monastery on Relics Prime, where he spent his remaining years in meditation and occasionally screaming at clouds. His replacement was a pragmatic individual named Serath, who took one look at the galactic situation and made peace with reality. "We have 3 options," she announced during her first session. "We can keep fighting this and lose. We can ignore it and pretend it's not happening. Or we can embrace it and at least try to minimize the damage." The Council chose option 3. They created the Private Military Operations Commission, which was supposed to oversee and regulate the industry. The PMOC was staffed primarily by former military personnel from various species, including a significant number of humans who decided that regulating violence was more profitable than conducting it. The irony was not lost on anyone. KFT Solutions, by this point, had grown into something resembling a legitimate corporation. They had an HR department, they had retirement plans, they had sexual harassment training seminars that were somehow more awkward than actual combat. They also had approximately 3,000 employees spread across 50 star systems, handling everything from border disputes to pirate suppression to what they diplomatically called regime change consultation. Gillian, now the CEO, because apparently shooting people could lead to executive positions, sat in her office on the company's new headquarters station and wondered how they'd gotten here. They'd started with 32 people and a converted cargo ship. Now, They were a galactic mega-corporation with stockholders and quarterly earnings reports. Diego handled operations. Yuki managed legal and compliance. Together, they'd built an empire on the galaxy's inability to solve its own problems. "Do you ever think," Gillian asked during one of their weekly meetings, "that we're making things worse? That by professionalizing violence, we're just encouraging more of it?" "Every day," Diego admitted. "But I also think about the Yelvari, and the Corellians, and the 38 other species we've helped who'd be dead or conquered if we hadn't intervened. We intervened for money. Does the motivation matter if the outcome is the same? Philosophically, yes. Practically, I don't know anymore." Yuki, who'd been reviewing contracts, looked up. "The galaxy is violent. That's not our fault. We didn't create the wars. We didn't invent conflict. We just found a way to profit from something that was happening anyway." "That's what every arms dealer in history has said," Gillian pointed out. "Yes," Yuki agreed, "and they were right. Weapons exist because violence exists. We exist because the galaxy needed people who were good at organized violence and weren't squeamish about charging for it. The Council tried to wish away reality through legislation. We just acknowledged what was already there. That doesn't make it right." "No," Yuki said quietly, "but it makes it true." They sat in silence. Three people who'd accidentally revolutionized galactic warfare by understanding that semantics matter and lawyers are cheaper than principles. "We could stop," Diego suggested. "Sell the company, retire, let someone else figure this out." "Someone else will just do what we did," Gillian said. "Probably worse. At least we have standards. Standards we invented to make ourselves feel better about what we do. Standards that have saved civilian lives," Yuki countered. "We don't target non-combatants. We don't use prohibited weapons. We don't take contracts that violate council regulations. That's more than most governments can say." "We're still mercenaries," Gillian said. "No matter what we call ourselves, no matter how many forms we file, we're people who kill for money." "Yes," Yuki agreed. And I don't know if that's something I can keep doing." Diego leaned back in his chair, looking tired. They'd been at this for 6 years now. 6 years of contracts and conflicts and deaths and paperwork. 6 years of turning warfare into a business model and then wondering if the business model was eating their souls. "The Council asked us to testify," he said, changing the subject, "about the industry, what regulations are working, what needs to change. They want the humans to tell them how to regulate the industry the humans created," Gillian said. "That's either brilliant or the stupidest thing I've ever heard." "Probably both," Yuki said. "When do they want us?" "Next month, full session. They're calling it the Private Military Operations Summit." "They're calling it a summit?" Gillian laughed. "We've turned mercenary work into corporate conferences. What's next? Team-building exercises in the asteroid belt." "Actually," Yuki said, "we should do that. Good for morale." The summit was exactly as tedious as expected. 3 days of presentations, panels, and discussions about proper conduct standards for professional violence. The attendees included representatives from 83 private military companies, all of them carefully avoiding the word mercenary while describing what was obviously mercenary work. Gillian gave the keynote speech, which she'd written while slightly drunk and questioning her life choices. "The Galactic Council," she began, "spent 300 years trying to eliminate violence through legislation. This was admirably idealistic and completely stupid. Violence is not a legal problem. It's a reality problem. The universe is violent, species are violent, conflicts happen. You can't ban them into non-existence any more than you can ban gravity or bad cafeteria food." Scattered laughter. "What you can do," she continued, "is regulate how violence is conducted, make rules, enforce standards, punish violations. This is not ideal. Ideal would be universal peace and harmony and everyone holding hands singing folk songs. But ideal is not available. What's available is pragmatic harm reduction, which means accepting that violence will happen and trying to make it slightly less awful." "Is that what you've achieved?" called someone from the audience. Making violence slightly less awful? No, Gillian admitted. We've made it more efficient, more organized, more professional, which might be worse, honestly. We've turned war into a corporate service industry. Future civilizations will study this period and conclude we were all insane. So why do you continue? Because someone will do it anyway, Gillian said. Because the conflicts exist whether we participate or not. Because being pragmatic beats being idealistic when people are dying. Because we have mortgage payments and employee salaries and contractual obligations. Take your pick. That's remarkably cynical. That's remarkably honest, Gillian corrected. Everyone else here is pretending we're noble security consultants protecting the innocent. We're not. We're mercenaries who found a legal loophole and drove a corporate structure through it. We're people who are good at violence who decided to monetize that skill. The only difference between us and the mercenaries the council banned is paperwork and branding. The room was silent, but Gillian added, we're also the reason the Yelvari still exist, and the Corellians, and about 60 other species who would have been conquered or exterminated if they'd waited for the council's committee meetings to save them. So maybe being mercenaries isn't the worst thing we could be. She sat down. The moderator, looking uncomfortable, moved on to the next presentation. That night, over drinks in the station bar, Diego raised his glass. That was quite a speech. I may have been too honest, Gillian admitted. You think? Yuki was smiling, though. You basically told the entire galaxy we're shameless profiteers with good PR. We are shameless profiteers with good PR. True, but usually we're more subtle about it. They drank in comfortable silence, 3 people who'd accidentally changed the galaxy by understanding that rules only matter if people can't find ways around them. The Council's proposing new oversight mechanisms, Yuki said eventually. Stricter regulations, more monitoring. They'll never enforce them, Diego said. Probably not, but they'll try and we'll adapt. And they'll try again. It's a dance. A very expensive dance, Gillian added. Our legal costs last quarter were absurd. Cost of doing business, Yuki said. Literally, we bill it to clients now. Regulatory compliance fees. Everyone pays them. Everyone pays us to help them navigate regulations we helped create, Diego said. That's genuinely evil genius. That's corporate consulting, Yuki corrected. Completely different. They laughed, because the alternative was examining too closely what they'd become. 5 years after the summit, the private military operations industry had stabilized into something resembling normalcy. There were established companies, recognized standards, professional certifications. You could major in private military operations at several universities. There were trade publications and industry conferences and annual award ceremonies for excellence in conflict resolution. The galaxy had accepted what the Council had tried to prevent, violence as a service, properly regulated and taxed. Human companies dominated the market, holding roughly 68% of all contracts. They were efficient, effective, and expensive. Other species competed, but humans had a head start and an unfortunate aptitude for organized violence. The Council's peacekeeping initiative still existed, now with 20 ships and 2,000 personnel. Their primary function was investigating violations of private military operations regulations and filing reports that private military companies largely ignored unless the fines were significant enough to matter. Quorvath died peacefully in his monastery, never knowing that the galaxy had named an award after him, the Quorvath Prize, for semantic excellence, given annually to the company that most creatively interpreted council regulations. KFT Solutions won it twice. Gillian Kowalski retired at 53, wealthy beyond her wildest dreams and ethically compromised beyond her worst nightmares. She'd built an empire on violence dressed up in corporate terminology, and she wasn't entirely sure how she felt about that legacy. You changed the galaxy, Diego told her at her retirement party. He was still running operations, planning to work another 5 years before stepping down. I found a loophole, Gillian corrected. That's not the same thing. You found a loophole that saved millions of lives, while ending thousands of others. The universe is complicated, Diego said, which was possibly the understatement of the millennium. Yuki gave her a gift, a framed copy of the original council regulation banning mercenaries, because we wouldn't exist without it, she explained. Gillian hung it in her apartment on Earth, where she spent her retirement writing a memoir that her publishers insisted should emphasize the heroic aspects of her career and minimize the morally ambiguous parts. She ignored this advice. The book, titled Professional Violence: How Humans Turned War into a Business Model and Why the Galaxy Let Us, sold surprisingly well among military historians and people who enjoyed reading about humanity's capacity for creative rule-breaking. The Galactic Council continued trying to regulate the industry they'd accidentally created. They passed new laws. Private military companies found new loopholes. It became background noise in galactic politics, like trade disputes or arguments about proper planetary orbit terminology. The violence continued. It always had. It always would. But now it was organized, regulated, and properly invoiced. Somewhere in the Council archives, buried under 14 layers of bureaucracy and bad filing systems, was the original mercenary ban. It remained technically active, which meant that technically private military operations were still illegal. Nobody mentioned this. Nobody wanted to open that particular can of legal worms again. The galaxy had learned a valuable lesson. You cannot legislate reality away. You can only adjust how you respond to it. Humans had understood this instinctively, because humans had spent their entire history finding creative ways around rules they didn't like. The Council had wanted to eliminate violence through law. Humans had demonstrated that violence, like water, simply flows around obstacles. Ban mercenaries and you get contractors. Ban contractors and you get consultants. Ban consultants and you get advisors. Ban advisors and you get observers who occasionally shoot people for research purposes. The only way to truly eliminate private military operations would be to eliminate the conditions that made them necessary. That would require solving poverty, resource scarcity, territorial disputes, ideological conflicts, and basic interspecies hostility. The Council formed a committee to study that problem. The committee estimated it would need approximately 5,000 years and a budget that exceeded the gross domestic product of 30 star systems. They scheduled their first meeting for next Tuesday. In the meantime, conflicts continued. Private military companies responded. The galaxy spun on, violent and complicated and completely indifferent to anyone's attempts to make it otherwise. KFT Solutions took another contract, this time for a species whose name translated roughly to people who really should have developed faster-than-light travel before pissing off their neighbors. The pay was excellent, the ethics were questionable. The paperwork was filed in triplicate, business as usual in a galaxy that had finally admitted what it had always been. A dangerous place where people paid other people to do violence on their behalf, and everyone pretended this was somehow different from what it obviously was. The Galactic Council had zero tolerance for mercenaries, right up until the moment they realized they couldn't actually enforce that preference without hiring someone to enforce it, which would make them mercenaries by definition, which would violate their own law, which would require another committee to investigate, which would take approximately 6 months, during which time another 3 conflicts would start. So they gave up, quietly, officially, with proper documentation and legal justification. And humans, who'd been fighting for money since approximately 5 minutes after inventing money, looked at the galaxy's moral crisis and saw a business opportunity. That was the real story. Not that humans were violent, but that humans were practical. The galaxy wanted violence without calling it violence. Humans were happy to provide that service for a reasonable fee and with excellent customer service ratings. 68% market share and counting.